Today, the European Union stepped up the pressure on Israel to support a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The message was crystal clear from Brussels. Two states, Israel and Palestine, are the only credible way to have peace in the Middle East. European Union foreign ministers held talks in Brussels today on the conflict. Israel's foreign minister and the Palestinians' top diplomat were both at the table. France's foreign minister said there will be a need for a Palestinian state with security guarantees for everyone after the war in Gaza has ended. Other ministers echoed that call, as well as appealing for the release of Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. This puts the European Union on a collision course with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He refuses to consider Palestinian independence, and he says that Israel must control security from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, an area that would include an independent Palestine. Now, that statement brings Israel again into conflict with its number one ally, the United States, as well as other international allies, such as Germany. Germany is a staunch supporter of Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, she's paid several visits to Israel since the October 7th terror attacks. Today in Brussels, she made it clear that Berlin thinks a two-state solution is the only way to achieve long-term peace.
Israel can only be safe if Palestinians are safe and if they can live with dignity. And Palestinians can only be safe and live with dignity and freedom if Israel is safe. That is why the two-state solution is the only solution. And all of those who are not in favor of this have so far failed to come up with an alternative solution. There can only be peace if there's peace for all the people living in the region.
Let me pull in our correspondent now, Rosie Burchard. She's been following the meeting in Brussels for us. Rosie, tell us what the EU wants to see happen in the Middle East when the war in Gaza is over.
Yeah, well, the EU says that quite simply the only way to ensure a sustainable and enduring a credible peace in the region is to have the creation of a Palestinian state. But of course, that's not simple at all, is it? And nor is it anything new. This is the EU's long-standing position. But the accusation that's been levelled at the bloc, and even really acknowledged by the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, is that for decades, the EU and other global actors have been paying lip service to this idea, but not actually doing anything to back up those words. Now, what we've seen here in Brussels is an effort to try and have the EU move from being what really looked like a bystander in this deadly conflict to a bit more of a broker. So we saw Brussels today corralling round different actors, so the Israeli foreign minister, the Palestinian foreign minister, but also counterparts, for example, from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from Egypt. And what Brussels is trying to do is float some ideas, including, for example, what it's called a preparatory peace summit that would involve those actors, but also, for example, the United Nations and the United States to try and look at some of these big ideas for the future. So the bid to try and broker something here is certainly underway. Whether or not it's going to actually make any difference, especially on the ground, as we know that very dire humanitarian situation, both for Gazans and for Israeli hostages, which rages on. And of course, as mentioned by a lot of foreign ministers here in Brussels today, that situation simply is not getting any better.
And we know that the Israeli Prime Minister, he has basically, trashed the idea of Palestinian statehood. I'm wondering what makes the European Union think that it's going to be listened to by the Israeli government?
Well, I think the European Union feels that it was not listened to, and I certainly sensed a bit of frustration at these talks here in Brussels today. For example, I was told ministers showed up expecting to have a conversation about a two-state solution with their Israeli counterpart. Instead, the Israeli Minister Katz, went on to show two videos which included connectivity projects, including an artificial island off Gaza. So that really seemed to spark a bit of disappointment among EU ministers. We had the EU's foreign policy chief saying that really the Israeli minister could have used his time better. And I even spoke to Portugal's foreign minister on the sidelines of these talks, and he was even more strident, saying really calling on Israel Prime Minister to revise his position. Of course, from the Israeli side here, there was calls to really keep the focus on that situation. The Israeli minister brought out pictures of a baby that's being held hostage. And of course, this is a really primordial question of security for Israel, not least to say, of course, the Palestinian minister who was present had a similarly passionate appeal talking about the plight of Gazan children.
Yeah, let me ask you, Rosie, we've got about a minute left. What about inside the European Union itself? I mean, how united is the EU when we're talking about a push for a two-state solution?
Yeah, the EU is united in that call for a two-state solution, but that's really about it. The European Union is divided overall on how to approach this conflict. We have, on the one hand, for example, Germany, which really emphasises Israel's right to self-defence due to, not least, that historical responsibility that Germany has to protect Jewish life. On the other end of the spectrum, countries like Ireland and Spain that have been quite clearly and early on calling for a permanent ceasefire there. Now, what I would say is that in the early days after that terror attack by Hamas on October 7th, there was a real cacophony of different positions from the EU. That messaging has now quietened. There is less of a kind of messy messaging. What I think will be the case is that moving forward, EU states will continue to really speak more on their own behalf and less as the EU 27 as a united bloc here, simply because what they can agree on is very little and in many ways limited really to that call for a two-state solution.
Rosie Burchard with the latest from Brussels tonight. Rosie, as always, thank you. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has once again rejected what he says are conditions for the release of hostages being held by Hamas. And there has been no let-up in the fighting in Gaza. Palestinians say that the city of Han Yunis has been subjected to the worst bombardment since the start of this war. Officials say at least 50 people have been killed and more than 100 wounded. Gaza's health ministry, which is run by Hamas, and Hamas, as you may know, is classified as a terrorist organization.
Smoke billows over Gaza's southern city of Khan Yunis as Israel's military continues its bombing campaign. Its latest strike forcing dozens of the wounded into hospitals that are overwhelmed and under-resourced. Children and babies are among those injured or killed. Doctors say they're struggling to treat patients.
I'm telling you, the hospital is on the brink of collapse. We all are. We're running out of medical staff and supplies. Nothing is reaching us. There's nothing in the hospital to treat patients with. No painkillers, no anesthetics, no medical resources.
Israel's military has been focusing its offensive on the southern city, where its battles against Hamas fighters are intensifying. Explosions and gunfire echo through the refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. Most of the population have had to move more than once to find safety.
Where do we go? This is the 17th time I've left my home. Where am I supposed to go? To Rafah? Rafah is just one street. What do they want from us? Do they expect 2.3 million people to live in an area that's no wider than 200 meters and can't be longer than a kilometer?
Pressure is mounting on Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after he rejected terms offered by Hamas to end the war in Gaza in exchange for the release of hostages there, and opposed the creation of an independent Palestinian state. And relatives of Israeli hostages in Gaza disrupted a parliamentary committee meeting calling for their loved ones to be freed. This comes as EU leaders meet in Brussels to discuss the situation in Gaza and what will happen after the war. While there are deep divisions on calling for a ceasefire, many, including the EU's foreign policy chief, still think establishing a two-state solution is the only way forward.
I think that we have to stop talking about the peace process, and start talking more concretely about the two-state solution process. Because peace, it could be many different pieces. What kind of a peace you're talking about? So let's talk about what we want to do. And we want to do is to build a two-state solution.
Meanwhile, in Gaza, many are trying to find a place that's not under siege in order to bury their loved ones, as the number of casualties and displaced people continues to rise.
All right, for more now, I'm joined by Shayna Lowe. She's communications advisor for the humanitarian organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council. It's good to have you with us. So the worst Israeli attacks in Han Yunis since the start of Israel's invasion. That's how residents there are describing it. What are you hearing from Gaza?
What we're hearing from our teams in Gaza is that the situation in general continues to deteriorate day after day. We cannot even access Khan Yunis and have not been able to access Khan Yunis for days because of the fighting that is ongoing there and the challenges in keeping our own staff safe. We do have a handful of staff who have been seeking shelter in places in Khan Yunis, and it's been very difficult for us to even maintain contact with them to know whether or not they are safe.
We understand that many Gazans are now leaving Khan Yunis and fleeing to Rafah. Is there safety for them there?
No, there simply is no safe place in Gaza so long as these hostilities continue. We desperately need a ceasefire to put an end to this madness, to put an end to this hell that Palestinians in Gaza have been subjected to for over 15 weeks now. We had staff members who lost members of their own family just in the last couple of weeks in Rafah. Rafah was, remember, supposed to be the safe place. Now we're seeing over 1 million people cram into less than 1/5 of the territory in the Gaza Strip, seeking out some type of shelter. There's no space in designated shelters to host these displaced people. Disease is spreading quickly in overcrowded shelters due to unsanitary conditions. Sewage is flooding the streets because people simply don't even have bathrooms to go in to use. And so this is a situation that is increasingly concerning to us, and we're increasingly concerned that Israel might continue their ground operations further south into Rafah, where so many civilians have sought refuge.
The European Union is now pushing hard for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. That is now in direct opposition to what the Israeli Prime Minister wants. The U.S. also wants a two-state solution. I mean, these differences have never been so clear and they've never been so public. What does this type of tension mean for your work?
Well, I think Netanyahu's statements this week really demonstrate what we've been warning about in the West Bank for years now, that Israelis continue to illegally colonize and settle in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, destroying any opportunity or potential for a negotiated two-state solution. We've seen Palestinian communities forced off their lands, forced out of Area C of the West Bank. These are some of the most vulnerable communities. I think the international community needs to continue to put pressure on Israel to abide by their obligations under international law. Of course, all parties to this conflict must be abiding by international law. But what we've seen is a complete rejection from the Israeli government and its leaders of the internationally acceptable political solution for this conflict. It's indeed very troubling.
Shana Lowe, Communications Advisor with the Norwegian Refugee Council in Jerusalem. Shana, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And as we said, the families of those hostages being held by Hamas today stormed the Israeli parliament. Our correspondent Tanya Kramer in Jerusalem has more.
There have been a group of relatives of those hostages. They're believed to be 136 hostages are still believed to be held in Gaza by Hamas and other groups there. They have been storming a parliamentary session of a committee saying that enough is enough, that they shouldn't sit there, they should do something to the parliamentarians. And we've seen this here in the past days. There have also on Sunday night, there have been relatives and families of those hostages. They have pitched tents in front of the Prime Minister's private residence in Jerusalem, saying they're not going to budge from there, they're going to stay there, they're going to block traffic. They're becoming more and more desperate in the sense that they say we are not being heard by the politicians, and that what the government is saying, that more pressure on Hamas will bring those hostages home or will bring another deal, is clearly not working, and that every day those people, their loved ones, are staying in Gaza is a difficult day, and that their time is basically running out.